The organization had operated for 11 years. It was registered as a nonprofit dedicated to helping vulnerable populations transition into stable housing and employment. The website featured testimonials, success stories, and images of smiling people who had supposedly rebuilt their lives through the program. Annual reports were filed on time. Tax documents were publicly accessible. The executive director had spoken at community events and received recognition from local government officials for outstanding humanitarian work. On the surface, it was exactly what it claimed to be: a legitimate charitable organization making a measurable difference in the lives of people who needed help most. The investigation began 4 months earlier, when a social worker in a neighboring state noticed inconsistencies in a case file. A young woman had been referred to the organization for housing assistance. She completed an intake interview, signed placement agreements, and was transported to what was described as a transitional living facility. 3 weeks later, she missed a mandatory check-in appointment. Follow-up attempts went unanswered. The facility address listed in her file didn't match any registered residential properties in the database. The social worker filed a missing person report. Local police investigated, but found limited leads. The organization provided documentation showing the woman had voluntarily left the program and declined further services. The case went cold until a similar pattern emerged 6 weeks later involving a different person referred to the same organization. Federal investigators took an interest. The organization operated across multiple states, which gave federal agencies jurisdiction under interstate commerce and trafficking statutes. Surveillance began quietly. Financial records were subpoenaed. Communication logs were analyzed. What emerged was a structure far more complex than a single charity helping vulnerable individuals. The organization had intake centers in 6 cities. Each center operated under a slightly different name but shared common branding, leadership, and operational procedures. People were referred to these centers by social services, homeless outreach programs, and occasionally by individuals who had seen advertisements promising job training, housing, and fresh starts. Intake procedures were thorough. Identification was collected. Background information was documented. Placement agreements were signed that authorized the organization to arrange housing, employment, and support services. These agreements included clauses allowing the organization to act on behalf of participants in matters related to housing, employment, and legal documentation. Once someone signed those agreements and entered the program, they effectively disappeared from public tracking systems. Family members who tried to maintain contact were told that participants were in transitional facilities with limited communication access for therapeutic reasons. Social workers who followed up received polite responses explaining that participants had moved to different facilities or had voluntarily exited the program. The reality was different. People who entered the program were being moved through a network of properties that weren't registered as transitional housing. They were being placed in labor situations that violated wage and safety regulations. Their identification documents were being held by program staff. Their communications were being restricted, and their ability to leave was being systematically eliminated through a combination of debt manipulation, Federal investigators identified 89 individuals who had entered the organization's programs over a 3-year period and subsequently lost contact with family, social services, or legal representatives. 89 people who had signed agreements seeking help and then vanished into a system that claimed the warrant was issued on a Tuesday morning. The target was the organization's primary intake center, located in a renovated building that had once been a medical clinic. The facility had administrative offices, interview rooms, a small dormitory area for short-term housing, and a basement level that records indicated was used for storage. Intelligence suggested that between 5 and 8 staff members would be present during daytime operations. The executive director frequently worked from this location. Participants in the intake process typically stayed at the facility for 48 to 72 hours before being transferred to other locations. SWAT was requested because the building's layout created tactical challenges. Multiple rooms, interior corridors with limited sight lines, a basement level accessible only through a single stairwell. The risk assessment indicated low probability of armed resistance, but acknowledged that any operation involving potential victims required controlled, methodical execution to prevent harm. The entry was scheduled for 6:15 a.m. before normal business hours, but early enough to ensure that any overnight staff or participants would still be present. Surveillance confirmed lights on in the administrative section. No vehicles were parked in the small lot adjacent to the building. 16 operators divided into 3 teams. Primary entry through the front administrative entrance, secondary team positioned at the rear emergency exit, third team responsible for perimeter security and managing any individuals who might attempt to flee the location. At 6:14 a.m., teams moved into position. The building sat on a quiet street in a commercial district that was mostly deserted at this hour. Neighboring properties were offices and small retail spaces that didn't open until later in the morning. No pedestrians. Minimal vehicle traffic. The front door was reinforced but not beyond standard commercial security. Hydraulic ram, announcement protocols, entry team flooding through the doorway and into the reception area. Lights were on. The space was clean and professional. Posters on the walls advertised job training programs and housing assistance services. 2 people were in the administrative office area. A woman at a desk near the reception counter. A man in an interior office visible through a glass partition. Both were detained within seconds. Neither resisted. Standard procedure. The first sweep cleared the ground floor. Interview rooms were empty. The small kitchen area was unoccupied. Administrative offices contained standard furniture, filing cabinets, and computer equipment. Nothing appeared unusual. Nothing suggested criminal activity. The dormitory area was on the 2nd floor. Operators moved up a central staircase and entered a corridor with 6 individual rooms. 4 of the rooms were locked from the outside. The locks were simple deadbolts, the kind typically used on bathroom doors. Not sophisticated security hardware, but enough to prevent someone from opening the door from inside. The first room held 3 people, 2 women and 1 man. They were awake, sitting on beds in a space furnished with basic furniture and nothing else. No phones. No personal belongings visible beyond a few changes of clothing. When operators entered, none of them stood. None of them asked what was happening. They just watched with expressions that suggested this wasn't entirely unexpected. The second room held 2 people, both women. Same setup, same minimal furnishings, same lack of personal items. One of them had bruising visible on her arms. When asked if she was okay, she nodded but didn't speak. The third and fourth rooms held similar occupants. 11 people total on the 2nd floor, all adults. Ages ranging from early 20s to late 40s. None of them had identification on their person. None of them had phones or electronics. When operators asked why the doors were locked from the outside, the responses were vague. Safety reasons, security protocols, program rules. The individuals in the rooms didn't challenge these explanations. They accepted the locks as a condition of their participation in the program. But program participants in a transitional housing facility don't get locked in their rooms. Vulnerable individuals seeking help don't surrender their identification and communication devices as a condition of receiving assistance. And people entering a legitimate nonprofit don't disappear from contact with families and social services for months at a time. The basement level was accessed through a door in the main administrative corridor. The stairwell descended approximately 12 feet. The space below was divided into 2 sections. The first section contained standard storage, file boxes, office supplies, cleaning equipment. Nothing unusual. The second section was behind a locked door, not a standard interior door, a reinforced security door with a commercial-grade deadbolt and a keypad access system. The kind of door that protects high-value assets or sensitive materials. Operators forced entry. The room beyond was approximately 20 feet by 15 feet. One wall was lined with filing cabinets. A desk sat in the center with multiple computer monitors. And covering another wall was a large map with colored pins marking locations across 6 states. Each pin corresponded to an address. Next to the map was a whiteboard covered with names, dates, and location codes. The system was color-coded. Red pins indicated intake centers. Blue pins marked what were labeled as transitional sites. Green pins were designated as placement locations. The network spread across 6 cities and included dozens of properties. On the desk were physical files organized by name. Each file contained intake paperwork, identification photocopies, signed agreements, and placement records. The files documented where individuals had been sent, when they were transferred, and what type of work. One file was open on the desk. It belonged to a woman who had entered the program 6 weeks earlier. Her intake paperwork showed she had been homeless, had no local family connections, and was seeking assistance with housing and employment. Her placement record indicated she had been transferred to a facility marked with a blue pin on the map, approximately 80 miles away. The notes in her file described her as low risk, and she wasn't in a transitional housing facility. She was in a labor camp. The federal agents who entered behind the tactical teams immediately recognized what they were looking at. It wasn't a case of administrative negligence or poor record-keeping. This was an organized operation using the infrastructure and credibility of a nonprofit organization to recruit, document, and distribute vulnerable individuals into exploitative labor situations. The executive director was located in an upstairs office. She was detained and placed under arrest. When questioned about the locked rooms, the basement files, and the map documenting multiple facilities, she declined to answer. When asked about the individuals currently housed in the facility, she requested an attorney. Federal agents began processing the scene. The files in the basement were photographed and cataloged. The computers were seized for forensic analysis. The individuals found in the locked rooms on the second floor were interviewed by victim advocates and provided with medical assessments. None of them understood they had been trafficked. Most believed they were participating in a strict but legitimate program designed to help them rebuild their lives. The restrictions on communication, the locked doors, and the confiscation of identification had all been presented as standard security measures. The agreements they had signed gave the organization broad authority to make decisions on their behalf. The map in the basement revealed the scope of the network: 6 intake centers across different cities, 23 transitional sites where individuals were held for processing, 41 placement locations where people were being used for labor. The operation had been running for at least 3 years based on the earliest dates in the files. Federal coordination began immediately. The 6 intake centers were raided simultaneously within 4 hours of the initial entry. Each location yielded similar findings: locked rooms, restricted communication, files documenting transfers and placements, individuals who believed they were participants in a legitimate program but were actually being systematically exploited. The transitional sites were raided next. These were properties located in rural areas or industrial districts. Some were described as group homes. Others were labeled as training facilities. All of them operated with minimal oversight and maximum control over the people housed there. The placement locations were the final priority. These were farms, warehouses, construction sites, and service industry businesses that were receiving workers through the organization's network. In some cases, the business owners knew they were receiving trafficked labor. In other cases, they believed they were participating in a job training program and were unaware of how individuals were being recruited and controlled. The total count reached 89. 89 people who had entered the organization's program seeking help and ended up trapped in a system designed to exploit them. They were located across 6 states. Some had been in the network for weeks. Others had been moved through multiple facilities over the course of 18 months. None of them had been reported missing in a way that triggered widespread attention. They were adults who had signed agreements with a legitimate nonprofit. Their families, when they existed, had been told the individuals were in structured programs with limited communication. Social service agencies had been provided with documentation explaining that participants were thriving in transitional housing and employment training. The system was designed to be invisible. It operated within legal frameworks just enough to avoid scrutiny. It targeted people who were already marginalized and unlikely to be vigorously pursued if they disappeared. And it used the credibility of a registered charitable organization to deflect questions and maintain operations. The investigation revealed the financial structure. The organization received government grants for providing transitional services. It collected fees from businesses that received workers through the placement program. And it generated revenue by billing individuals for housing, transportation, and services at rates that created perpetual debt. People who entered the program were told they owed money for intake processing, housing costs, and job training. These debts were documented in their files. When individuals questioned the charges, they were told that the amounts would be deducted from their future wages. But the wages never materialized. Or when they did, the deductions exceeded the earnings, creating a cycle that prevented anyone from accumulating enough money to leave. The timeline was reconstructed through file analysis and victim interviews. The organization had been founded 11 years earlier with legitimate intentions. The founder had genuine experience in social services. The initial operations were small-scale and focused on helping a limited number of individuals transition from homelessness to stable housing. The shift occurred approximately 5 years into operations. Financial pressures mounted. Funding was inconsistent. The organization struggled to maintain services. At some point, a decision was made to supplement legitimate services with revenue-generating placements. A few individuals were placed in work situations that weren't ideal but generated income for the organization. That evolved into a more structured system. More placements, more revenue, more control over participants to ensure they completed work assignments. The organization grew. Multiple locations were established. The operation scaled up while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate nonprofit helping vulnerable populations. By the time federal investigators intervened, the organization had processed hundreds of individuals through its network. Most had eventually been released or had managed to leave. But 89 remained in various stages of exploitation across the 6-state network. The timing of the raid was critical. Files seized from the basement revealed that a large-scale transfer was scheduled for the following week. 40 individuals currently housed in transitional sites were set to be moved to placement locations. New intake participants were scheduled to arrive at 3 of the 6 centers. The network was preparing for what internal documents described as an expansion phase. If the raid had been delayed by 7 days, those 40 individuals would have been distributed across multiple states to new locations. Tracking them would have become significantly more difficult. Rescue operations would have required coordinated efforts across additional jurisdictions. The 11 people found in locked rooms at the primary intake center were scheduled to be transferred that afternoon. Vans were arranged. Destination facilities were prepared. If the entry had occurred 12 hours later, those individuals would have been gone. The executive director was charged with federal trafficking offenses, conspiracy, fraud, and multiple counts of forced labor. Additional arrests followed as investigators identified staff members at other locations who were actively participating in the operation. Some claimed ignorance. Others admitted they knew the program wasn't operating as advertised, but believed they were helping people find work opportunities. The 89 victims were placed in federal protective services. Medical assessments revealed widespread malnutrition, untreated injuries, and psychological trauma. Many had been threatened with deportation or criminal charges if they attempted to leave. Some had been told their families would be harmed. Others had simply been convinced they had no other options. Victim advocates worked to provide comprehensive support. Legal assistance for immigration status where applicable. Medical care for physical injuries. Counseling for trauma. Job placement services through legitimate organizations. The process of helping 89 people rebuild their lives after systematic exploitation required coordination across multiple agencies and nonprofit partners. The organization's assets were seized. Properties were confiscated. Bank accounts were frozen. The network infrastructure that had been built over years was dismantled within months. The investigation expanded to include the businesses that had received workers through the placement program. Some business owners faced charges. Others cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced penalties. For the SWAT operators who made entry that morning, the operation reinforced a fundamental reality. Criminal enterprises can exist behind legitimate facades for years without detection. The building looked like a non-profit office. The staff appeared to be social workers. The paperwork was professionally organized. Nothing about the exterior presentation suggested that people were being locked in rooms, stripped of their identification, and moved through a network designed to exploit them. The discovery in the basement changed everything. The map, the files, the documentation of a system that had been operating for years while presenting itself as a humanitarian organization. It was hidden in plain sight within a structure that society had been trained to trust. The 11 people found in locked rooms on the second floor had been there for less than 72 hours. They were new intakes. They hadn't yet been transferred to transitional sites. They hadn't yet accumulated the debt that would have made leaving feel impossible. They were at the beginning of a process that would have eventually moved them into the same exploitation that the other 78 victims had experienced. The raid interrupted that process. The intervention happened before the transfers. The rescue occurred while 89 people were still locatable within a documented network. And the timing, though planned based on investigation rather than immediate crisis, prevented a scheduled expansion that would have made subsequent rescue operations exponentially more complex. The organization's website remained online for 3 days after the raids, while federal agents analyzed traffic and identified additional individuals who might be attempting to access services. The site was eventually taken down and replaced with a notice directing people to legitimate social service agencies. The phone numbers associated with the organization were disconnected. The social media accounts were seized as evidence. Community organizations that had referred people to the program were notified. Social workers who had sent vulnerable individuals seeking help were informed that those referrals had potentially resulted in trafficking situations. The revelation created widespread concern about vetting processes and oversight of nonprofit organizations that provide services to at-risk populations. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. Files, financial records, victim testimony. The executive director was convicted on all counts. Sentencing included decades in federal prison. Other staff members accepted plea agreements with varying terms based on their level of involvement and cooperation with investigators. The victims' recovery continues. Some have been able to return to families they lost contact with during their time in the network. Others are rebuilding lives independently with ongoing support from victim services. Several have become advocates, sharing their experiences to help identify trafficking situations and improve protective systems. The organization's former facilities were either sold or repurposed. The building where the initial raid occurred is now a community health center, operated by a different nonprofit with robust oversight and transparent operations. The basement room with the map and files has been converted into storage for medical supplies. For the 11 people found in locked rooms that morning, the intervention was immediate and life-altering. For the 78 others located across the 6-state network, rescue came days or weeks later as federal teams worked through the documented locations. All 89 were eventually removed from the investigation remains a case study in how trafficking operations can operate within legitimate organizational structures. The use of a registered nonprofit, the careful documentation that mimicked proper social service procedures, the targeting of vulnerable populations who were unlikely to be aggressively sought if they disappeared. The network design that distributed victims across multiple jurisdictions. The system worked for years because it was designed to look like help. People seeking assistance were given housing, food, and the promise of employment. The restrictions were presented as program requirements. The debt was explained as standard cost recovery. The locked doors were described as security measures, and beneath all of it was an operation that systematically exploited some of the most vulnerable people in society while maintaining the appearance of providing humanitarian services. It existed in plain sight. It operated across 6 states, and it required an accidental discovery by a persistent social worker to trigger the investigation that eventually brought it down. The raid at 6:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning wasn't the beginning of the investigation, but it was the moment when 89 people who had been invisible within a legitimate-seeming structure became visible again. It was the intervention that prevented scheduled transfers. It was the discovery of files and maps that documented an entire network. And it was the end of an organization that had spent 11 years building credibility in order to exploit the trust of people who had nowhere else to turn.